Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to start talking about World War II in Europe in earnest, as we look at the various steps that Hitler's going to take to break the Versailles Treaty, and we're going to go through the early phases of the war where Hitler unleashes his Blitzkrieg. So, here's your objectives for today. Take a moment and take them in, and let's dive into our narrative. For anyone who was paying attention, Hitler had been laying out his plan and his strategy for a while, ever since the whole beer hall pushed and his very, very short jail sentence. So here's an excerpt from Mein Kampf, where Hitler explains what his plans are in general for Germany and Europe. So let's move forward, let's read it, and then we'll move forward. This idea of living space becomes absolutely central to Hitler's plan. He was concerned because, of course, Germany lacked the overseas colonies that a lot of other countries had, and he wanted to have area, especially agricultural and industrial areas, to expand the German people, to expand German territory in order to make Germany self-sufficient because of the brutal sort of deprivation that the Germans faced during World War I, and, of course, the struggles in the 1920s being dependent on foreign loans and things like that. So this idea of expanding into Eastern Europe and making sure that Germany had the territory to support itself was a really important part of Hitler's whole ideology. Unfortunately, of course, because it's Adolf Hitler, it involves the murder of a ridiculous number of people. And so the Hunger Plan was the plan to expand Greater Germany and then use the sort of Slavic and Jewish peoples of those areas as laborers, potentially as slave laborers, starving them to death or using them as second-class citizens in order to create this perfect Aryan world that Hitler was trying to create. And so from the very start, it was clear to anyone who was reading Hitler's work that if Germany was allowed to fully expand and do the things that it wanted to do, it would probably lead to genocide because, again, that's the whole plan of this. Although in general, Hitler was not advertising, at least in the national press or to the German people, that genocide was going to be a part of his whole deal. Hitler's steps to break the Versailles Treaty were very sort of incremental, right? It's an idea called dosage, where as you start stepping up what you're doing very gradually, people generally don't react to each step because each step itself is not aggressive enough to warrant maybe a declaration of war. So Hitler is first going to march into and reoccupy the Rhineland, the sort of area in between Germany and France, which German troops were barred from because of the Versailles Treaty. Europe at this point is facing a massive economic depression. So, are they willing to go to war over Hitler just moving troops around in central Germany? Well, in Western Germany, it turns out they're not. And so Hitler's able to reoccupy the Rhineland, start opening up factories again there, move troops to the French border again. And the rest of Europe is going to mostly sit by, despite the fact that, again, this is technically a violation of the Versailles Treaty. Then Hitler's going to complete the Anschluss with Austria. This is the annexation of Austria. Austria is ostensibly a German nation, kind of, or at least German ethnically. We talked about this back when we talked about German unification, the Austrian problem of who is German and who is not. And so Hitler, to some degree, saw himself as completing the work of Otto von Bismarck and uniting the German-speaking people, the folk, together. Austria was annexed through a popular referendum. As you can see here, there's some choice architecture and obviously some pressure from pro-Nazi forces within Austria. But the Austrian people did vote to join Greater Germany, even if the election was not as fair and free as one would like. And so for the rest of Europe, again, this is a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But if Austria chooses to join Germany, are we really willing to go to war over this? And the rest of Europe said that they were not. Then we've got the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland is a part of Czechoslovakia that is ethnically German and German-speaking. Hitler started demanding the annexation of the Sudetenland to create his greater Germany that he was trying to create. European powers started really balking at this because, again, this is 3 steps over the line with the Versailles Treaty, and they started to be feel very uncomfortable that maybe, obviously we need to do something at this point. This is starting to get out of hand. They hold a conference in Munich in which Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, meets with Hitler, and they sit down and talk, and Hitler is able to convince Neville Chamberlain that all he wants is the Sudetenland. He does not want the rest of Austria, and once he gets this territory, Greater Germany will be completed and he will be satisfied. This ends up being a complete lie. Neville Chamberlain makes a complete fool out of himself, going home and claiming that he's secured peace in our time. And then Hitler annexes first half of Czechoslovakia and then the rest. The rest of Czechoslovakia is then divided up between Poland and Hungary. Czechoslovakia vanishes into Greater Germany, and Hitler becomes increasingly emboldened, believing that because the Allies didn't declare war over this, maybe there is no line that he can really cross, and he can continue to more or less do as he chooses without any major repercussions. Here's Neville Chamberlain's famous speech, which is, again, really, really humiliating for him later when, obviously they go to war. So, here we go. And Neville Chamberlain, his name becomes synonymous with this idea of appeasement, giving in to a dictator's demands in order to present a larger conflict. In Chamberlain's defense, England at this point was not prepared for war, and some historians have said that Neville Chamberlain is going to put into place, is going to start mobilizing England, understanding that war is probably coming, and that all of this was mostly a delaying tactic in order to stop Hitler or to keep Hitler pacified until England was actually ready to fight them. But based on how the war goes once it actually begins, that's kind of a difficult argument to make. But again, I'll let you decide whether or not Neville Chamberlain was a savvy political operator or was just a fool who was taken in by the charismatic Hitler. Hitler is then going to unleash his war machine against the rest of Europe. And so we'll pause and talk about what that means momentarily. The step that Hitler takes that's finally over the line is the Partition of Poland. Hitler and Stalin sign a secret non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, in which they agree not to attack each other and that they're going to divide up Poland between them. Everyone understands that this is going to mean war. England and France have told Hitler after the annexation of Czechoslovakia that any more territorial grabs will mean war with England and France. So Hitler, of course, secures his western or eastern flank over here. The Soviets, of course, Hitler wants to avoid a two-front war, Germany's problem in World War I. So signing a peace treaty with Stalin horrifies the rest of the world because, of course, Stalin hates fascism and Hitler. Hitler hates communism and Stalin. But they agree to not fight each other, at least for now. Here's the famous political cartoon with Hitler and Stalin. And Poland is going to disappear, divided up between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. Everyone understands that there'll probably be conflict between these two dictators in the future, but at the moment, of course, this is terrifying to everyone because Hitler now has a free hand to easily fight a one-front war against the Allies. England and France declare war against Hitler, and we prepare for general war in Europe again. The Germans are going to, in their invasion of Poland, use a new strategy called Blitzkrieg. We'll take a moment and pause and read this, and then we'll go in and talk about it. Blitzkrieg is a new type of mechanized warfare in which you use aircraft as mobile artillery, so you don't have to haul around the massive, massive guns we saw in World War I. You're also using panzer tanks as sort of the armored assault forces, punching holes in enemy lines, and then mechanized infantry units, jeeps and things like that, to then go around and cause havoc behind what would have been stationary enemy territory. And so infiltration tactics with mechanized infantry units are incredibly, incredibly effective. Poland falls in a shockingly short period of time. And this new style of war is going to make the sort of trenches of World War I obsolete. But of course, that's not apparent to everyone at this point. Poland's army was relatively large on paper, but everyone thinks that Hitler's Blitzkrieg, okay, it worked against the Poles, who were not a particularly technologically advanced army at this point, but against real armies like England and France, it's going to have a much harder time. The Soviets then launch an invasion of Finland in order to try to expand their territory, now that they don't have to worry about Nazi Germany, and honestly, it goes horrifically for them. The Winter War was incredibly hard fought. The Red Army really, really struggles to gain any ground against the Finns. And this is really surprising to most people because on paper, the Soviet Union should be able to crush Finland. As far as why this actually happened, take a moment and pause and read. Turns out killing all your best military leaders really creates problems in the chain of command, and the Red Army, because of Stalin's paranoia and purges, might not have been the fighting force that it looked like on paper. And so the Soviet Union may have been a paper tiger, and the Winter War might have also led Hitler to really dismiss the power of the Soviet Union and the Red Army. Hitler's then going to take Denmark and Norway without much struggle. This is important to him because it creates submarine bases in the Atlantic in order to set up his blockade of England. Submarine warfare is somewhat of an underlooked but really important part of World War II. And so German submarines are going to begin unrestricted submarine warfare again, sinking supplies going to England, attempting to win the war of materials. But as far as actual general war in Europe, the English and the French are going to fortify their troops along the Maginot Line. They've created incredibly modern defenses here that they believe will be effective against Hitler's mechanized divisions. The Maginot Line at this point is a technological marvel designed to really supercharge the sort of trench defenses of World War I, to prevent gas attacks, to make it immune to shelling. You've got barbed wire, you've got heavy artillery, you've got anti-tank barricades and things like that. And so there's a real sense that, yes, Hitler was able to crush Poland, but once he goes up against Britain and France, this whole thing is going to be much, much more difficult for him. And so it really becomes a war of waiting in Europe as Hitler mobilizes for his attack on England and France. And England and France are to some degree a little complacent in thinking that they're totally prepared for whatever Hitler can throw at them. In the end, this leads to some really fun cartoons like Run Adolf Run, which again, if you've never seen Run Adolf Run, you 100% should watch it. We're not going to watch it here, but take a moment, go and watch Run Adolf Run. It's hilarious and pretty ironic. In the end, Hitler's invasion is way, way more successful than anyone had hoped for, or than Hitler had hoped for. I mean, I guess it was as successful as Hitler hoped for. It was way more successful than what the Allies felt could be done. Hitler was able to invade through Belgium again, which the Allies thought was impossible. They thought the Ardennes forest would be too dense for mechanized infantry, and so that Hitler's Blitzkrieg would have to hit the heavily fortified Maginot Line. But Hitler was able to navigate the Ardennes much better than anyone had hoped, and so was able to crash through Allied defenses, sweep around behind them, and France fell unbelievably quickly. The Allied troops defending France were then trapped against the English Channel. And within the span of a few weeks, what was thought to be, again, like a potentially a generations defining war was more or less over. The Allies pushed all of their troops to Dunkirk and then were finally able to evacuate. The evacuation at Dunkirk, there's a whole movie about it if you're interested, was one of the sort of Herculean efforts, getting all these troops off the continent before France fully fell. But France vanished in less than a month. And so the barrier, the massive military force that held back the entire weight of the German army in World War I is now gone. Northern France was occupied by Germany, including Paris. Southern France was organized into a free French government that was ostensibly more or less a German puppet state, which is going to become important later. The government of France was set up in Vichy here, and they found enough French people to ostensibly run the government to claim that France was still there. And Germany is going to sign a treaty with Japan, sort of for reasons that we're going to get to. We talked about it from the Japanese perspective, but joining together, seeing themselves as fighting back against sort of the liberal Western world, this democratic vision of the world, and potentially sharing, resources and things like that at some point. Hitler had planned an invasion of England called Operation Sea Lion, but a combination of his inability to get air superiority over Great Britain, and at the same time, the difficult weather of the English Channel is really going to prevent this from happening. But Hitler is mobilizing troops and potentially preparing for the invasion of Great Britain. There are plans for the invasion of England, and so Hitler is preparing for this. But the Battle of Britain really stymies him. The British are able to crack the German code through the creation of the Enigma machine. And so reading Hitler's coded messages allows the Allies to send up troops and send up planes in order to fight back against the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain takes the place over a number of months, and in the end, Hitler is unable to break the resolve of the British troops. He never gets the air superiority necessary to launch his invasion, and England is going to hold out against Hitler, although they are going to suffer horribly. The Blitz was the repeated bombing of England, specifically English cities, generally at night. So take a moment and pause. And so, obviously, horrific suffering for the British people. Of course, we get the famous "Keep calm and carry on" posters here to try to convince the British to go about their daily lives while they're being bombed into oblivion. And total war is now coming to England. Hitler's goal now becomes to starve the British out, to defeat their resolve, and to get them to surrender. And it seems as if Hitler is completely ascendant here. He's completed all his objectives. I mean, he hasn't invaded England yet, but France is gone. And on its own, England is probably not going to be able to stand against the might of Nazi Germany for long. And so Churchill gives this famous speech in order to sort of bolster British resolve. So take a moment and pause. And then we'll leave you with that. If you've never seen the video, the propaganda film London Can Take It, definitely go and watch that. It's 100% worth your time. And we'll leave our story with Hitler Ascendant as we move to the war in Asia and talk a little bit about the early phases of the Japanese expansion and why they eventually got the United States into the war and then the long-term effects of all of that. So we'll leave you there for now. Thank you for listening.